Tales from the Break Room is a viewer submission podcast. To have your story featured on the show, send it to us at darkstories.org under the category Scary Work Stories. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
If I told you the bathroom here at Dead and Roasted was haunted, would you avoid using it? Or would you run on in there looking for ghosts to peep on, you sick freak? Oh, by the way, I've got some brand new scary and supposedly true work stories about the Mudman, uninvited guests, and more for you today. Joining me in the break room is my friend Rogue Darkness. You can find more from Rogue Darkness on YouTube. Just search for Rogue Darkness, subscribe, and enjoy content on the occult and terrifying. Now then, these are tales from the break room. The Mudman, from Mr. Mystery 555. I'm a 19-year-old freshman that works at the local McDonald's in my local town to pay off student loans. We've all been there, right? I like this job a lot, especially since I met my now fiancée, Morgan, while working there. I liked doing this job day by day until this one October night of last year, where my feelings for the job and how I see it took a dramatic change. That day was no different than any other. I got here at the time I always did, which was 3:45 p.m., giving me 15 minutes to talk among my fellow coworkers about the particular customers we didn't like, or the ones we actually did like, those kinds of things. That's when one of my coworkers, named Joe, said something that sent shivers down my spine. "Hey, you guys ever heard of the Mudman?" Another coworker, Ryan, and I just looked at him and said, "What are you even on about, man? Did you drink a little too much last night?" He looked at us and smiled, replying, "You'll see. He comes when workers like yourselves take the overnight shift." It's a good time to mention that our particular McDonald's was open 23 hours at the time this took place, with 1 hour of downtime to clean and bring more supplies out for the next shift. Before I could say much more about Joe's weird story, it was time to clock in, and the day went on normally for a while. Of course, I avoided Joe a bit more than usual. Some time went on, and eventually it was 11 p.m. It was now time for us to take that 1 hour cleaning break I'd mentioned. Joe handed me the keys and said goodnight to the remaining crew, which was me, Ryan, and Morgan, the manager, but not before warning us all to be careful and to make sure the doors were locked. We all looked at him and told him to go home, to stop fooling with us because it wasn't funny. He left soon after, and it was just the three of us. Morgan sent me to the lobby to lock the doors, which I did, while Ryan grabbed food from the freezer and Morgan turned off all the drive-through lights. I was in the middle of helping Ryan move some things from the freezer real quick before I headed to the lobby to lock the doors. That's when I heard the lobby door open and the distinct sound of footsteps moving across the lobby floor. I looked over at Ryan, who then looked at me, and after a moment of silence, I spoke out. Sorry, we're closed. You can come back in an hour." However, there was no response to this. With no reply, I walked out to the lobby to repeat myself in case the person had not heard me. However, what I found was a lobby door wedged open, and these muddy footprints leading to the bathroom door. I picked up the broom that was sitting next to me and slowly walked to the bathroom, yelling back for Morgan to turn the lights for the bathroom on, which she replied, I never turn them off." My heart sank, and I slowly walked to the bathroom door, watching the lights turn on in front of my eyes as I pushed open the door. Inside, I saw an old man washing his hands. "Hey, I apologize, sir, but you can't be here right now. We're closed temporarily." The old man just smiled and apologized, saying it was just an emergency. I took a sigh of relief and let it go, turning around and walking away. Right as I reached the bathroom door, the old man said, "Have a good night." I turned back to say the same to him, but when I did, the old man was gone. I ran out, ignoring Ryan and Morgan's questions at first, as I still couldn't believe what I just saw. Where had the man gone? Before I knew it, it was 2 a.m., and after cashing out my last customer, it was time for me to finally go home. Before I took the long drive home, I knew I'd have to use the bathroom first. So I did, but this time I went for the ladies' room, as the lobby was closed at midnight, and there was no one left in the lobby, so I didn't think anybody would mind. After finishing up my business, I went to the sink to wash my hands. That's when I saw it. I swear, when I looked in the mirror, I saw the old man's face staring back at me. I saw mud running down his face from his eyes, even from his mouth and nose. The lights flickered as he reached his muddy hand out to me. I screamed, thinking this was the last of me, until the lights stopped flickering and the door swung open, revealing Morgan staring down at me, as I've now somehow ended up on the floor. The old man in the mirror was gone. It was just me and her. I rushed by her, running out the front door to head home, swearing the whole way to never come back. I quit the next day, and I didn't go back. Working with a Dark Witch. From Sancho. Before I tell this story, I must warn you, there will be mentions of animal torture and killing. Bear with me, I'm not a great storyteller. This is a story of when I used to work with a witch, and not the good kind. I work in an AC and plumbing factory. I work in the back of the warehouse prepping everything for the workers to install in new homes. When I started working there, I got along with the rest of the people there, and everything was going pretty good until a couple of months ago. The lady that cleans the offices began acting weird towards me. She used to be a normal, typical worker like the rest of us, and nothing seemed off about her. But one day, seemingly out of nowhere, she started asking me questions, like, "Do you believe in black and white magic?" At first, I didn't see anything wrong with it. I thought maybe she was just curious. But the questions started to get weirder and weirder each day. She began asking questions like, "Would you ever try to do any type of magic?" And, "Would you kill cats or dogs for sacrifices?" I started to get a weird feeling from her. It was then I began to think she was a witch. But I would just tell myself that I'm just paranoid or overthinking it too much. As time went by, she started looking bad physically. Her eye bags looked darker than black. It looked like she hadn't slept in years, and most of the time, she would miss work for no reason. One day when we were getting ready to leave, I went to the break room to get a drink, and she was already getting ready to leave in a hurry. But on her way out, she dropped her bag, and from it, a lot of Polaroid pictures fell out. I went to try to help her pick them up, but what I saw was something I had never seen before. The pictures showed animals with cuts in their stomachs and their ears cut off. She hissed at me like some angry cat, then pushed me away, not wanting me to see the pictures. Then she left in a hurry. I didn't tell anyone because I was scared she would do something to me or my family if I tried to get her in trouble or fired. I had troubled sleep for days. All I was thinking about was what she did to those poor animals and what she might want to do to people. For the rest of the week, she did not show up to work, but the week after that, she came back. I couldn't even look at her then, but she continued to greet me with a smile, acting as if nothing had happened. The day went by normally, nothing too unusual, except for her staring at me most of the time. The days went by and the rest of the coworkers started to notice how she was acting, and they decided to fire her. The day she was fired, she was leaving, and she screamed out, Y'all are going to regret this. That same day, when I clocked out to head home, I went to the parking lot towards my car. It was dark then, 11 p.m., and I saw a car with the headlights on. I assumed it was just another coworker about to head home, but oh boy, I was wrong. When I passed by that car, I saw that lady sitting there, just looking straight at me with a weird face. I got scared and started jogging towards my car, and once I got in, I locked all the doors and turned it on. But then, when I was leaving, I looked back at that car the lady was in, but she was gone now. Weird, kind of freaky. I hauled tail out of there, and about 10 minutes into my drive, when I was on my way home, I felt something odd, like a presence. I had the distinct feeling there was someone in my back seat. I looked around, but there was no one there. Another 5 minutes of driving went by, and again I felt as if someone was breathing on the back of my neck. I looked behind me in an instant, and what I saw sitting there was the lady I worked with, the psycho. I then lost control of my car, and I crashed. It was pretty bad. For 2 months I was hospitalized. I broke 3 ribs, both of my knees needed surgery, and I couldn't breathe by myself. I had to be hooked up to machines for a while. Luckily, that was the end of it. Nothing else creepy happened. Thank God I'm still alive to be able to tell my story of when I was working with a possible witch.
The Macrame Purse, from Emma D. My mother started a job at a local university back in 1978. Her intention was to take advantage of the tuition remission benefit so that I could go to college, as she was a single mother with limited income. She was excited, and because of that, I was excited too. I didn't really understand what she meant. I was only 8 at the time, but it sounded good, and she was happier than she had been in a really long time. A string of violent muggings on campus happened shortly after she started. It was summer, it was hot, and money was tight. Mom kept talking about something called inflation. I heard her talking to Grandma and Grandpa about a girl that was murdered not too far from Mom's building. They found her body in the bushes behind the student union, but was trying to find out who she was, as her purse was missing. If she'd had a book bag, that was gone too. Days turned to weeks, then months turned to years, and I never heard any more about it. If they found who she was, my mom never mentioned it. I forgot all about it. Flash forward to 1988. I was finally able to take advantage of the wonderful education benefit. Mom was still working in the same office as she had been for years. Colleges would sometimes hire students to do the running around campus to deliver or to pick up things, distribute mail, and pick up supplies. They called them student helpers. Her office had hired a freshman student helper, and Mom was glad because she didn't have to go down to the supply room. She hated that place. I mean, really hated it. Felt like there was someone lurking in the shadows. She said it made her feel cold, sad, and angry. It wasn't so much of a supply room as just a room at the end of the hall with a wall of tall metal storage cabinets blocking off a larger vacant space. It was poorly lit and only illuminated the immediate storage area. The further back, the darker it got. I never knew what it was supposed to be, or how far back it really went. Anyway, I was sitting in Mom's office, waiting to go home at the end of the day, when we heard running in the hall getting closer to the office. The student helper burst into the office, completely out of breath. In her arms were a box of manila folders, some green hanging folders, and something else. I couldn't tell what it was, so I got up for a closer look. Mom and her coworker Elaine also got up. We surrounded Ellie to see what was wrong. I got these out, shut the door, and this fell off of the top. she said breathlessly. I don't know how. Maybe I shut the cabinet door too hard. She trailed off. Mom was shocked, looked at Elaine and said, I think it looks like an old macrame purse. She took it, held it up by the sides as the woven shoulder strap was broken. It was gray from dirt, but at one time it must have been a creamy white. It was a macrame owl purse. I vaguely remembered them from my childhood when everything was macrame. Big brown wooden beads made the eyes. The bottom of the purse was an upside-down triangle, completing the owl's head. The top opening was folded over with a smaller wooden bead, which made the beak. The bead was to hold the purse closed, but it was torn, hanging by a few threads. A white fringe with smaller brown beads swung at the bottom. It must have been beautiful when it was new. We went over to Mom's desk, and she sat back down, gingerly holding the bag before her. Tentatively, she lifted the flap, peered inside, and then started carefully taking things out. We all pushed in closer, curious. Carefully, she took half-empty packages of cigarettes out first. Its golden brown wrapper reminded me of my childhood. Then my mom said, "Oh, Lord, I used to smoke those before I quit." Then she pulled out a red lighter. "Well, whoever it was must have been a smoker, huh?" muttered my mom, then set it down on the desk. A half package of some kind of green stick gum, its content hard as bricks. A pink cylinder of lipstick. I reached over, uncapped it. Pretty, kind of a berry shade. Quickly, I put it back down. This felt like an invasion of someone's privacy. "Oh, wow!" exclaimed Elaine as my mom took out a pair of ticket stubs from a Heart concert back in 1978. The summer before school started, in the fall. Faded, handwritten lyrics to Dreamboat Annie and a scribble on it and a heart. Maybe this could have been a favorite song. The scribble said, "Love you, baby girl." No, not an invasion of privacy, more like sacrilege. "Ah, there it is, the wallet," my mother said with an affirmation. It had owls on it too, brown, olive, and gold. Signature 70s colors. "Let me see if we can..." She stopped short. We all shivered. Out of nowhere, a cold breeze drifted through the office. I will never forget that. It was fleeting, but it was a definite cold breeze. And then, it was gone. Sadness, like melancholy, filled my heart for a moment. Then anger. This wasn't fair, damn it. We stood in silence, hoping for a student ID or driver's license, something. Then I saw a picture of a young woman with long hair. She was wearing flare jeans, tight-fitting horizontally striped knitted shirt, sitting on the knee of a mustached guy. She had her arms around his neck. His encircled her waist, pulling her close. She was smiling. She was happy. "Oh my God," said my mom suddenly. Then, in a softer voice, she whispered, "After all these years." She looked up suddenly and said, "This belonged to Vicky Jones. The family identified her, but they never found her purse. It was here the whole damn time." "Who?" asked Elaine and Ellie simultaneously, but I knew. She was the very same girl who had been mugged and killed when Mom started all those years ago. She was killed for what? She was a college student. She probably had maybe $5 on her. "I gotta call campus police," Mom said quietly with a little reverence. Ellie was holding the picture, her eyes filled with tears. Someone knew her, loved her. It's so sad. Yes, it was. Turns out, the campus police located Vicky's parents. Well, one of them. The father had died a few years later, but her mother was still alive, and they gave her the purse. Finally, after 10 years, there was closure. As for the storage room, Mom didn't mind going down there anymore. She said it felt different, almost lighter. Maybe Vicky had finally moved on. For a little background, my mother and I were talking about the Indigo Man when she reminded me about what happened to her when she was working at the local college here in Cincinnati. I remembered it then, and with her help, I was able to fill in some gaps in my memory, and it gave me more information that I didn't know, because I was a kid. But I do remember when Ellie found the bag. It was sad, but at least it had a somewhat happy ending.
Calls to the university. From Spike. I recently started working at a big university in my city. For the most part, I work completely alone in this big room with industrial sterilizers. I remember when I was doing my training, I'd asked about the phone in the room, whether it worked or not in case of an emergency. I was told the phone was no longer hooked up, that I would need to use my cell phone if something were to happen. I didn't think much of it past that. A couple of months go by, and one day I'm sitting in the room alone, listening to a podcast. Heck, it might have been this one. As I was listening to a part in the podcast where someone said, "Whatever you do, don't answer the phone," I kid you not, right then the disconnected phone in the room began to ring. I nearly jumped out of my skin, freaked out by the timing with what the person in the podcast had just said, and a bit confused as to how an old phone that was disconnected now worked. I slowly picked up the phone, and I managed to stammer, "Hello?" There was no one on the other end, just static and this weird, creepy, and old-timey music. I got chills, and I hung up the phone before the song ended. After I hung up, I quickly picked the phone back up, just to check. Sure enough, there was no dial tone or anything at all. As it should have been. It should not have been able to make or accept calls at all, so how had it rang? A few days went by, and I eventually forgot about it. Until one day the phone rings again, only this time when I answer it, there was a voice on the other end. It said, "You shouldn't have answered." Now, thinking this was just someone's joke on the new guy, I hung up again. These calls would continue to the point where I was getting them every other week on this supposed broken phone. The voice would say things like, "I can see you," or "Better watch out." I would often try to ask, "Who is this?" or something along those lines, but I would never get an answer back. Just that static and weird music. I would ask some coworkers if this had ever happened to them, but they all said no, and they would look at me like I was making it up. Eventually, I took the phone right off the wall and got rid of it myself. I never did find out who the calls were coming from, or what they wanted, or even how a phone would work when it wasn't even hooked up to anything. I still get the feeling sometimes that someone is watching me in that room, but at least I'm not getting weird ghost calls anymore. The Peeping Tom whom I met on the job. From So-Nora. Quite a few years ago, long before my haunted restaurant days, I did in-home care for the county I lived in. That particular job entailed me traveling from one client's home to another, pretty much all day. This is where I met the Peeping Tom of this story. It was at my second client's apartment that day. He was introduced to me by the client as the maintenance man for the apartment complex she lived in. He would just do basic handyman fix-it type of duties in the tenants' apartments, as well as the yard work around the small complex. I say small complex because that apartment complex was only 2 stories tall, and only had about 20 or so apartments in it. On the day that the maintenance man and I were introduced, everything seemed fine and normal. No red flags as of yet, anyway. My client and I sat and talked with him over lunch, since she was a sweet person and he had come over on short notice to fix her leaking faucet. He told us a little bit about his wife and kids, and how much they loved playing outdoors on his expansive property and their new side-by-side ATV. He even jokingly said that if I were ever near his neck of the woods, I should stop by and meet his family, and take a ride on his side-by-side to tour his woodsy property with its beautiful views, if I wanted. Fast forward to a few weeks later, when I needed to hire him at my new house to do some emergency plumbing, because my normal plumber was away on vacation at the time. My client agreed that he would be a great fit for the job, and plus he really needed the extra money. So she gave me his business card, and I called him up to schedule him for the next morning. He showed up on time and did the work, although I found it to be honestly a little bit janky, if I may say so. What he did worked, though. It was just that he didn't even bother to go get the right parts to make the plumbing permanent. So I ended up with a sort of long-term but temporary fix. Everything was fine after he did the job. He then left, still showing no red flags or anything like that. Until a month later. That's when he began to call me for really weird reasons. Like he would just want to know if I was working with that client the next day or whenever. He wanted to know that because, according to him, he needed to do some work she had called him about, but he was unable to reach her on the phone. Weird, I thought, especially since I thought he had worked in her apartment complex almost every weekday. So why couldn't he just knock on her door or let the manager know? But I brushed it off, considering I had just moved into that house, and I had a lot of work to do on it to make sure it was more livable and comfortable. Soon enough, the calls came more and more frequently over the next couple of weeks, until I woke up with 17 voicemails from him one morning. Enough was enough with that. When I went to work for that client the next day, I showed her all the voicemails. She was absolutely appalled at seeing them all, and she immediately called the apartment's manager, informing them of the situation with the maintenance man and me. I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't totally awkward after my client made that phone call, but unfortunately it was. At first, I was able to just simply ignore him and go on about my job duties as per usual. But I wouldn't be writing this if that's all there really was to it, now would I? The calls began to really amp up, and eventually they turned into incessant texts. Some of these texts were angry, and some were basically inappropriate in nature. They were all nonetheless quite creepy. To my great dismay, I thought I was beginning to hear strange noises outside my isolated house some nights. At first, I figured it was just some local wildlife, which we got a lot of out in the country where I was. But since I happened to know a little bit of tracking, I got bored one late afternoon and decided to go out to explore and track a little. I was horrified to find several human, man-sized 13-inch outsole boot prints all around my house and field. I brought out my little tape measure just to make sure, and sure enough, it looked as though someone had been traipsing around outside my house, outside my bedroom window. I just knew, deep in my gut, that this was where all the strange sounds I'd been hearing late at night were coming from. I went out to a local electronics store the very next day after I got off work. I purchased a motion sensor night vision game camera for still pictures and a small night vision live camera for outside that I could view on my TV. At first, unfortunately, the game camera didn't really come up with any good pictures, except for some deer and a skunk. But one night, as I sat in front of my TV alone, I decided to switch from the satellite dish to the live camera that I'd placed outside a couple of days prior. I didn't see anything at all for the first few minutes, but that all quickly changed. I began to hear the faint and familiar sounds of light footfalls outside. Then, to my absolute, complete, and utter horror, I watched on my TV as a man in a dark hoodie walked right past my camera. I instantly froze, not knowing what to do. I didn't dare move a muscle or even breathe as I listened to him creep past outside my window. In my mind, my heartbeat must have been audible to him as he slipped past outside. I don't know why I didn't call the cops right then and right there, but I figured he was probably already gone, since all had gone silent outside once again. It wasn't until about 2 weeks later when I returned home from work to find both my front security screen, which I had locked, was standing open along with my previously locked front door, that I was forced to call the police at last. They sent out an officer, but all he could do was look at the footprints outside my bedroom window and file a report. Fortunately, however, the handyman was fired shortly after, due to unknown reasons to me, and all the weird activity outside my house at night stopped. If I learned even one thing from that whole scary experience, it's that you should always watch who you invite to your house, especially if you're a single female.
Lot 34, from Jason R. Until I watched your See Philly video, it didn't occur to me that we could post stories we were told by other folks. People who were perhaps willing to tell one person a story, but not willing to submit it to someone online to be read. Steve, let's just call him that for the sake of privacy, has done security work for a couple of decades now, and man, does he have some stories to tell. Up until recently, I also worked in security. I'm a disabled vet, and thanks to serving my country, I suffer from a laundry list of physical and psychological ailments. Security work is, for the most part, an easy paycheck. It doesn't pay well, but not much is expected of you, and the stress, especially on the graveyard shift, is almost non-existent, or so I thought. I worked second shift, and Steve was the guy who relieved me. He was on graveyard. Steve was a talker, and he was also former military. We had a lot in common, and I often found myself leaving work late because I'd been chatting it up with him. His wife, Nancy, also worked for the company. She was friendly and would throw in a few bits and pieces every now and again, but she wasn't like Steve in terms of sharing her experiences. One night, Steve and I started talking about some of the vehicles that were kept in the back lot. We provided security for what was, for all intents and purposes, a used/junk car lot. Outside of the rare thief trying to steal catalytic converters or the not rare enough skunk, there wasn't a lot for him to deal with. One night, while rambling on about, well, probably nothing, a cold wind blew through the guard shack. Steve stopped talking and looked at the ground. Judging from his reaction, I figured he decided we clucked on like hens for long enough. And then he asked me a question that stopped me dead in my tracks. You ever hear about what happened to the car in Lot 34? I paused. Sure, I'd seen the thing. The car obviously had either caught or was set on fire, and it burned so bad that parts of it had melted together. I'm not talking about small strips of aluminum. I'm talking about heavy metal components. No, I figured some kid got plastered and drove it into a gas station, I said, trying to be funny. Neither Steve nor Nancy laughed. In fact, Nancy gave me a dirty look and said, I don't want to talk about this, and promptly left. Now, I drove past this thing every day. Every single frigging time I saw it, chills would run up my spine. I always thought it was because of just how ugly the twisted metal hulk looked, but what Steve told me suggested that probably wasn't the case at all. I've heard a bunch of different versions of what happened, but there are two that sort of match up. Steve pulled up the collar on the cheap windbreaker the company had issued to him as it got colder in the shack. You know, We both heard the stories about the soon-to-be ex-wives setting their soon-to-be ex-husbands' cars on fire. Well, in this case, it apparently was the other way around. Now I say apparently because it supposedly was an accident. He looked angry. It wasn't any goddamn accident. Not if what they say happened actually happened. Now it was he who looked like he didn't want to talk about this anymore. This is where the story deviates a bit. One of my cop buddies told me that a guy knocked his old lady out and set the car on fire. That's the version I hope is true. Why in the hell would you hope something like that is true? Because the other version is worse. Much, much worse. How? I was told that some piece of shit found out his baby mama was about to become his baby mama for a second time. He couldn't afford the one kid, and he sure as hell couldn't afford another one. So, he knocked her out, dragged her into their car, and tried to make it look like it was an accident. Jeez, didn't the idiot ever hear of wearing protection? I asked. Why use a condom when you got a Toyota Corolla? His reply would have been funny if the story wasn't so heartbreaking. Full disclosure, I tried to verify the second, more horrific version, but the only story that somewhat matches the basic facts took place in Sao Paulo, Brazil, back in 2020. Anyway, there that ugly, he said fucker, I'm guessing, thing sat out on lot 34. Until one night, it wasn't there, he told me. What? You heard me. On your shift, you sit here and smile, take down license plate numbers, and wave folks through. On my shift, I have to do rounds every hour or so. He reached over for some coffee. I noticed that his hand had started shaking. Steve's old as dirt, and like I said, he served, so it's not uncommon for vets' hands to shake. I told myself that it was his age and his time that was causing the tremors. Whenever I start my round, I open the gate, drive through, and wait for the gate to close behind me. Now what I'm about to tell you has happened to me 3 times so far. By this point, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what he was going to say, but at the same time, there was no way I was going to leave now. A month back, I go in and do my thing. The gate closes, yada yada. Anyway, I drive past 34, and there that god-awful thing is. It felt like it was effing looking at me. He took another sip of coffee. So I do my lap around the yard, and there's nothing out of the ordinary. I open the gate and drive out. Wait for the gate to close behind me. You know the drill. Yeah, sure. Jay, when I got to the front lot, that car was in one of the parking spaces. Someone was punking you, I replied. How could they? I wish, he said. See, I thought the same thing for about 5 seconds. You've seen the thing. It doesn't have an engine or even wheels. When they offloaded it from the tow truck, it had to be dragged into its spot. It shot out sparks, made this god-awful screeching sound. And Jay, it gouged grooves in the concrete because its axle and drive shaft had melted together. The Lord Almighty couldn't have moved that thing from the backyard up to the front without the entire state having to cover their ears. He looked up at me, and I tell you, Daddy Darkness, he looked like he was angry at me for questioning him. That thing has moved 3 times. So, you called someone in to back up your story, right? Took photos? You know all the stuff you're supposed to do? Sure, I called Nancy. Eventually I was able to reach her and she came down, but not before it was back in 34. Wait, what? It knows, Jay. It was at this point that I thought I was the one being punked. It? What it? And what exactly does it know? It only lets 1 or maybe 2 people to see, or maybe hear it. I don't know how to phrase it. Anyway, when I tried to call Nancy, everything went wrong. I couldn't contact her. It rang and rang, but she didn't pick up. When I finally was able to get in touch with her, she told me her phone never rang. So I tried calling Clancy, our supervisor. The same thing. No one would pick up. I could tell Steve was becoming more and more agitated the more questions I asked. But to me, there seemed to be an obvious solution to the problem. If it were me, I'd have parked my butt right there and not moved until there was someone else there to see it. I did. Well, the second time I did. The first time I went back over to the shack and used the company phone. And naturally, when you looked back, it was gone. It mysteriously moved back to lot 34. What about the CCTV cams? There are so many things, so many people who report seeing ghosts don't do when this kind of crap happens. And you're saying the same thing they always do. Why not use the video recorder that's in your smartphone that's perpetually attached to your hand? There was no way he could argue with that. We should have it easier than most anyone else. The security company we work for has installed a rather extensive system of security cameras all around the car lot where we work. Yeah, look, I know. I looked. It didn't show the car up front. It didn't show the gate open. He paused. I think I forgot to mention that. During this whole time, the gate only opened when I tapped the fob and drove through. Other than that, the gate was closed and locked the entire time. There's nothing in the video. The car doesn't move. You don't see me driving through the gate and do my rounds and leave. Nothing. See, that's the kind of stuff that makes me find this hard to believe. Why just you? Why not everyone here during the day shift? She wants to be heard, wants us to feel her pain or whatever. Why is it just you? Have you ever been truly hurt? That rocked me back on my heels. He knew I had. Bad. Did you ever walk into a room full of people and have them see you cry or scream out in pain? Or did you just want one person to? Feeling he'd made his point, he continued. The second time this happened, I parked right in front of the thing. I needed someone to see this. Here we go, I thought. It faded, man. It just faded away. So I turned my car on, opened the gate, and hauled ass through to 34. There she was. No tire marks, nothing. It was like it'd been there the whole time. Steve, I want to believe you, man, but you gotta admit. I know. He sipped again. I saw it again the other day, but by then, I'd gotten the point and knew she wasn't going to let anyone else see her do her little vanishing act. He gave me an abrupt glare. Go home, man. I'll see you next week. And that's how the story ends. He told me later on that it had happened again. He told me that every time she moved, it was always to the same parking spot up by the shack. Every time, there was nothing on the CCTVs. Now, you might find this strange, but the things that stuck out in my mind the most were, why did it always go back to that one spot? What did he mean when he said faded? Obviously, I wasn't getting an answer to my first question, but when it came to the second, he said, Jay, I was staring right at it, and it was like, he really struggled to describe what he saw. It wasn't like what you see in the movies, where something just slowly vanishes. It was more like you're having a conversation, one that's coming to an end, and the person just slowly walks away. I don't know what Steve saw. I only know one afternoon I showed up for work, and lot 34 was empty. Not too long thereafter, a van with a busted front end was parked there. Neither of us knew what happened to the car in lot 34, but I think both of us hoped that if the second story was true, the lady and her unborn child have found solace and peace wherever they are. One last call before close from R.D. A number of years ago, I worked for the local council in a call center role, taking calls for all sorts of reasons, ranging from housing repairs to missed bins to dead animals to, well, just about anything. The local council had, for a number of years, actively advertised and promoted the call center's contact number, so members of the public would call for almost any and all reasons. Some calls were, as you would expect, rather hostile and angry. When dealing with things like council tax, housing repairs, or failed bin collections, it's only natural for people to be angry. Others were generally peaceful and were often simple inquiries about museum opening times or where libraries were in the city. But what made this role different from your usual call center job was the fact that, due to the people calling being locals of the city, along with the staff, we had what you would call regulars. People who called on a regular basis, always for the same reason. We had one guy who would always call and report about a dozen streetlights at a time being out or fault. This was almost always frustrating as the process to report them was long and cumbersome, involving tracking the light in question down on a map to get the exact code for it. Otherwise, nothing would get done. And this guy had an unfortunate habit of not really keeping track of the location, just giving us a light number, which often was useless. Another regular caller in particular will always stick with me. Let's call her E for the time being. E was an elderly lady who regularly called the call center to complain about a loud banging. Every call was distressful initially, with E practically in tears, screaming about the banging and how it went on over and over again. After my first time taking a call from her, asking for help from a manager, I was told the history involving E and how she was one of the regulars. There was no loud banging. What was happening was that E was hearing a feedback loop caused by her hearing aid and pacemaker being slightly out of sync. This was often made worse if she had recently had her medication switched, which would tend to result in her heartbeat being slightly higher than she was used to, and thus the feedback loop being made worse. The usual policy for E was to calm her down, talk to her, reassure her that it was being dealt with while we forwarded a request to her local housing office to get her support worker out to help her adjust. E's moods varied. When she calmed down, she tended to go one of two directions. She either tended to be upset with you for not resolving the banging straight away, or she was playful. I remember one time, during one of the many evening shifts I took where E was feeling a bit more chipper than usual, and was actually flirting with one of my work colleagues, much to his bemusement. It was a rather awkward spectacle, watching his reaction to being hit on by a lady in her late 80s, at least 4 times his age. This one particular night, I was on the fairly usual late shift. I say usual as I tended to volunteer to take them, as I found it was often far easier to wake up later and to go home later. It was about 20 minutes before the shift was due to end, and the call center due to close for the night, when my headset picked up, and I got a call. As I went through the usual spiel, the usual greeting, and asking how I could help, much to my chagrin, I was met with the now familiar, usual screaming about the loud banging. Of course, it was E. Now, the problem with E's calls was that they tended to drag on. You had to repeatedly reassure her, let her get everything out and log the call as required, but you couldn't rush her. If you rushed E, she got upset. If she got upset, the call worsened and getting more and more out of control as it went on. 20 minutes before close? Not good. I wanted to go home on time. I let E go on about the banging. I let her vent everything out, and as trained and as I knew, reassured her it would all be okay, that we would get it sorted out, that her housing team would contact her back most likely tomorrow, as the offices were all closed that night. But this is when it got just a bit more strange than usual. E was calming down. You could generally tell from the tone in her voice. But this time, there wasn't disappointment. There wasn't her usual mischievous mood either. Instead, her tone became much more apologetic and almost somber. "Thank you so very much. I am so very sorry. I know you do your best to help an old lady like me. You really do look out for us all, and I want you to know I appreciate it so very much. You have done so much to help me over the past few years." If it wasn't so very odd, so very out of character from E's usual calls, I'd have honestly felt flattered. I'd known of her and taken calls from her for a number of years at the point of this night, so this seemed like praise, a compliment even. I assured her she didn't need to apologize or to thank me. This was simply my job, and I'd help everyone just the same. But she insisted. She repeated it again and again as I sent the request through and noticed it was just about time to go. I calmly spoke to E to reassure her I'd sent the request, offering the reference, which she declined. With that, she said simply, "Thank you, be well," and hung the call up. I was getting to leave on time, but it still felt very off. As I went to log the last bits down, I noticed the evening shift manager giving me a dirty look. She scowled at me, and as she walked past me to get her coat, before the official closed for the night, she bluntly told me we'd have words the following day about why I decided to pretend I was on a call the past 20 minutes. I was confused, but there was no point arguing at that time. The following day I went back in to be met with that manager and hauled into a room and given a thorough chewing out, with her claiming that I had been deliberately faking a call for the last 20 minutes of the previous evening, that there was no one on the call, and I had just done this to get off early. I protested this, of course. I explained I was on the call with E, even had the reference still for the request I had raised for her. They could check with her if they were truly that insistent, under the guise of a follow-up satisfaction survey call. After I went back to my desk and took calls, as usual for a short while, maybe an hour or so, the manager came back, looking at me, confused. "Well, did you get in touch with E? She would tell you what I did and how I helped yesterday." But my manager looked upset and uncomfortable. After a deep breath, she looked at me. "I just got off a call with E's daughter. She said that E passed away last night." This sent a chill down my spine. E was an elderly lady, so fate was somewhat inevitable that she would one day pass on. But last night, just after we spoke, that seemed a bit creepy and off-putting. I asked when. 6:49 p.m. This caused me to shiver, and I could see it had upset the manager as well. The recording of the not call, which was me talking to no one, had a few distinct moments, and one was approximately the same time. I knew what it was. The moment I said she didn't need to apologize or thank me. At exactly that moment, the moment where E passed away fully, her final call was thanking not just me, but the call center staff and all for helping her over the years. Yet only I had heard it. The call monitoring equipment had not picked this up, and even my manager thought I had wasted time. But when my voice changed, my conversation shifted around that exact time, we both realized something had happened. So it is that even having happened all those years ago, I will never forget E or her many calls, as absurd or ridiculous as the situation may have seemed, because it seemed, in her last moments, that E had decided to somehow make one last call and thank us for helping her over the years before moving on from this world to the next. And when I think on that, it humbles me somewhat to think that I had the honor of taking that last call, even if it was from a most unconventional source.
Something in the Room, from Elisabeth. Something happened to me last December. I was house-sitting at my mom's while she was skiing in the Alps. As a programmer, I could work from home, and so I did. I was working more efficiently when not in the office, but that's not significant to the story. My mom's house is on the outskirts of a small German town, with a large yard, some small buildings around, and some tall old trees and many bushes. The house is pretty isolated. One night after a long weekend, I was sitting in the living room, working on my laptop and listening to music with my headphones. My work was going fast and smoothly, and I was in a very good mood, so I danced in my chair and shook my head in excitement. The music was playing loud, some old good heavy metal. But then I heard something over my headphones. It wasn't quite right. It didn't fit in with all these drums and guitars. Something in between the beats. I hit the space bar, put one headphone behind my ear, and listened. Everything was quiet, like a home should be. I mean, I heard the fridge from the kitchen and the silent roaring of the heating device in the cellar, but nothing unusual, nothing loud nor strange. I turned my music on again and went back to work, but after maybe 3 minutes, I heard it again. It wasn't okay, not because there could be a stranger in the house. Everything was securely locked, the blinds were closed, and the city was and still is pretty safe. But it could be a problem with the heating, the water, or the electricity. I stood up and made my rounds in the house to check the rooms and devices, but I found nothing, like nothing at all. I then made myself a cup of tea, and I went back to work again, putting my headphones with the music on. Then I heard something again. This time I called out, "Who's here?" Yeah, not the most clever call out, but I don't think I was expecting a response. But something did answer.
"Who's here?"
It was a deep, mechanical, and distorted voice. I don't know how I managed not to scream or jump. My heart skipped a beat and started hammering against my ribcage. I froze, trying not to breathe too loudly. I had to bite my lip hard to force myself to move, to lift my fingers off the keyboard and turn to the source of the noise. No one was there. No one. Just me. The blinds were closed. The lights were bright. Nobody here. "Hello?" I asked again.
"Hello?"
Repeated the voice 3 or 4 seconds later, but it felt like ages. I slowly stood up and went in the direction of this voice, to the couch in front of the TV. The table I worked at was behind the couch. I had no idea what exactly I hoped to find there, but what I did find was a toy. My niece's dang annoying toy. My sister-in-law had visited me with her 2 daughters, and the oldest one had played with it all the time. The thing was non-stop and more than annoying. It's one of those toys which records what you say and repeats it after a moment, slightly distorted, that is. I guess my sister-in-law forgot it intentionally, because the toy was really disturbing and upsetting. My niece was asleep when they left. Surely a parent shouldn't do something like that, but... All the while I heard these odd noises, I was probably mumbling or singing along to music. A good reason to work from home. And the toy just repeated it. How could I forget this thing exists? I turned the toy off, threw it back on the couch, and returned to my work, slightly shaken, still weak from fear and anger. But had I really been so loud that it hurt me? This time I worked without headphones. I just wanted to finish my task quickly and then maybe read or eat something in another room. I typed and was silent, definitely this time. Then the toy spoke again, or should I say read, because that's exactly what it did. It began to read my source code, symbol after symbol, letter after letter, number after number, even new lines. That isn't possible. I grabbed my notebook and ran from the room, slamming the door behind me. Unfortunately, I had to house sit for 5 more days, and I never entered that room again, not even to grab my charger. Instead, I just bought a new one. I have no idea what it could be. As far as I know, nobody died in that house, and there weren't any sacred places nearby, nothing like that. I've also never heard of any ghosts or supernatural happenings in that house. However, I know something was there, something that scared me to death, and I don't even think I want to know what it was. One thing I know for sure, next time my mom needs someone to take care of her house, she'll have to find someone else. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an ErieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at eriecast.com.